An unexpected opportunity, a story about work and relationships. My husband, when he was still my boyfriend, spent a long time convincing me that my legs were gorgeous and that I should show them off properly. He was the one who talked me into wearing high heels, nylons, garters, crotchless tights, and short skirts, so I guess he can be held responsible for the story I'm about to tell. I had just been laid off and was looking for a new job. A small retail firm had placed an ad in the newspaper for a secretary receptionist position, and although the pay was lower than what I was looking for, the job had the advantage of being only a 5-minute walk from my house. The money I would save on downtown parking and other transportation costs made me think twice about it. I applied and was called in for an interview. I showed up to the interview wearing a beautiful summer print dress that came down to just below the knee and white shoes with a 3-inch heel. The interview was one of the strangest interviews of my life. The first question George, the owner of the company, asked me was not about my typing skills, familiarity with the phone system, spelling, or ability to take dictation, but how would you feel about being a sex object for 8 hours a day? Apparently, the look on my face answered that question and also told him I was ready to get up and leave, and he rushed to explain. People who approached him during the workday sometimes had to wait a considerable amount of time before he could admit them. The longer the wait, the more agitated the person became. George said he discovered a way to diffuse the situation by placing an attractive secretary in the outer office, who didn't mind the attention she would attract. In fact, he said, secretaries who elicit appreciative glances are best suited for his purposes. I must have softened my expression a little because George smiled at me and said he couldn't help but notice that I had great legs and looked very sexy in high heels. He said that if I wore heels all the time, I would be perfect for this job since the receptionist's desk is open in the front and my feet would always be in view. I told George that I had no problem with being admired, but I wasn't going to put myself in a position where I had to constantly fend off unwanted advances. George assured me that none of his girls had ever faced such a problem. All I had to do, he said, was to look good for those who were waiting while I went about my other duties. Just get their attention so they don't think about being kept waiting. I had to admit that the job did appeal, but I was hesitant and told George that I would like time to think about it. He replied that he could give me until noon the next day, but that he thought I was perfect for the position and would raise my salary by $250 a month if I agreed. To make a long story short, I agreed. And it was exactly as George had said. I sat at my desk and showed off a lot of leg, and the callers seemed to enjoy every bit of it. I started wearing shorter skirts and opening my legs wider when I sat at the table. I made a habit of putting a lot of papers in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, although I had to go back later and rearrange some of them, bending at the waist so that my skirt would ride up and show my panties. The cock was teasing, and I knew it, but that's what I was being paid to do, right? Since I live close to work, I usually walked if the weather was nice. And on those days, I carried my heeled shoes in my bag and changed when I got to work. This became agonizing, so I started leaving the shoes I wore most often at work. One evening, about 3 months ago, I left work to walk home, and about 3 blocks from the office, I remembered that I had left some personal papers in the center drawer of my desk. When I returned to the office, I found my 2 pairs of heeled shoes lying in the center of the desk, which was odd, since I had left them in the bottom left drawer. As I bent over the desk, I noticed that the light in George's office was still on, and the door was partially open. I walked toward the door, intending to ask George if he knew what was going on with my shoes. But as I approached the partially open door, I was able to peek into the office, and what I saw answered my question. I saw George sitting in a chair with no pants on, stroking his body with one of my white shoes. I froze and tried not to make any noise as I watched him do this. I must have stood there for about 10 minutes, and some of the things he was doing must have been painful. But he didn't seem to notice it, or didn't care. Finally, he put down the shoe he had buried his nose in and began stroking his body furiously. I carefully backed away and walked out of the office. I don't know why, but I felt as if I had been insulted, and by the time I got home, I had decided that I would go to work the next day, confront George, and quit. I told my husband what had happened, and he laughed and said I should give the poor guy a break. After all, who did he hurt? Was he causing trouble for anyone? What would I gain by quitting? I decided my husband was right. George had always behaved like an impeccable gentleman to me, so what did it matter? And finally, two thoughts that kept popping into my head. Either George had a thing for heels, or he was thinking about me, and why, oh why, did I keep thinking about this body he was playing with? By the time I got to work the next morning, I had made the decision to keep my mouth shut, keep quiet about everything, and just live and let live. Over the next few weeks, I repeatedly found opportunities to watch George make himself look good by using my heels. I got to the point where I was touching myself while watching this and always made sure to wear the shoes he used the next day to work. My husband still thought the situation was comical and started telling me that I should go and help the poor guy. I took offense at him for even thinking I could do that, which only made him laugh even more. So one night, on some inexplicable impulse, I walked in on George. He was stunned. He froze half-heartedly and stared at me. I put my finger to my lips as a sign that I didn't want him to say a word and told him to just be quiet and enjoy. I walked over to his desk and sat on the edge. Taking off my tennis shoes, I wrapped my legs around his body, rubbing him a few times. I got off the desk and put on my shoes, walked around the office in them for about a minute, and then took them off and put them on the middle of his desk. I took off my nylons and placed them on the desk next to my shoes. "I'll see you in the morning, George." And I walked out of the office. I couldn't believe what I had done. I was a virgin when I married my husband, and the only guy I had ever touched was him, and here, out of the blue, I let another man use my legs for his games. I didn't just let him, I instigated the whole thing. The second surprise of the night came when I confessed to my husband what I had done. He was so turned on by my description of what I had done that he pulled me down and made love to me right on the living room floor. When we went to bed, he made me tell him the story again. And when I did, he made love to me again for an hour. In the morning, he asked me if I was going to do it again, and when I said I would probably go to work and find out I was fired, he laughed. "Oh no, you won't be fired. He'll probably be expecting you in his office tonight, and what you could get fired for is a no-show." "But what about us? I cheated on you last night. Don't you care that your wife let another man use her sexually?" "You didn't have sex with him. So, as far as I'm concerned, you didn't cheat. And as for us, I think the way I reacted last night should have shown you that we're fine." Nevertheless, I went to work the next morning in a very nervous state. George, however, was not behaving towards me in the usual way. Upon returning from lunch, I found a package on my desk. Inside was a pair of red high-heeled shoes in my size, 6 pairs of nylon boots, and an unsigned card that read, "Thank you for understanding." I intended to be the first to leave the office that evening and never spy on George again, but when 5 o'clock came, I found myself stalling until everyone left. I put on my new red high-heeled shoes and walked into George's office. He was on the phone with his wife, and I walked over to him and pushed his chair away from his desk. I bent over and unbuckled his belt and then pulled off his pants and underwear. Sitting down on his desk, I stretched out my legs, shod in high-heeled shoes, and began stroking his body. He excused himself to his wife, hung up the phone, and then took hold of me with both hands. When he finished his games, I headed for the front door. In all this time, neither of us said a word. That night, when I told my husband what I had done, he went crazy and made love to me 4 times. It was more than he could ever do, and poor darling was completely exhausted when he fell asleep. That started the next 3 weeks. 2 or 3 times a week after everyone had gone home, I would come into George's office for a mutual aid session. George never spoke during these sessions, and I limited my conversation to what was needed to let him know what I wanted. Once a week or so, I would receive a package containing 6 to 12 pairs of nylons and sometimes a new pair of shoes. And every evening I would come home and tell my husband what I had done for the day, and then he would spend the night trying to make love to death to me. Last Wednesday, I walked into George's office and found him on the phone with his wife. He gestured for me to leave, but for some reason I decided to show myself. I started stroking his body, and then I looked him in the eyes, smiled, and enthralled him with my games. I kept my eyes on him while he tried to keep up a conversation with his wife. I started teasing him and flirting with him. His eyes followed me as he continued to talk to his wife. I didn't hear George hang up the phone. The first time I realized he wasn't continuing to talk to his wife was when I felt a tingle in my foot and looked up at George. When his tongue slipped between my toes, I experienced incredible pleasure, and when I came to my senses, I left my shoes on George's desk, put on my tennis shoes, and ran home. My husband was a maniac that night. He made love to me so hard and long that I doubted if I could go to work the next day. In the morning, he blasted me. He wanted to come down to my office after hours and watch. I was cautious at first, but finally agreed that I would let him in on Friday. The next 2 sessions with George were repeated. On Friday, after everyone had left, I unlocked the front door and let my husband in. I warned him to be very quiet and then walked to George's office. The session started with George using my legs for his games. After a minute or so, I got up from the desk, lowered myself in front of him, and began caressing his body. Without raising my eyes from George's face, I got up, walked out of the office, and headed home where my husband kept me on my back for most of the weekend. I suspect I may have changed my relationship with George, but I won't find out until Monday when I go to work. My husband wants me to bring George home for dinner one night. If I still have work next week, who knows? It might be fun. The end. Subscribe to my channel. Thank you.